Hi everyone, this is going to be semi-experimental, so we'll see how it goes. I'm going to run through some slides and a few things, so it'll be mostly me talking to start with. Certainly the text chat line for anyone who's got questions or other bits and pieces that we can inject in, and then as we get further in we'll probably become a bit more interactive. So by way of introduction, I'm Graham Sawyer. I'm based in Darwin. I've got a background in education and technology fields going back too far, and also been doing a lot of work around biodiversity and environmental problems over that period of time as well. So this is a sort of a summary, I guess, of a lot of work we've been trying to progress around the sustainability and overarching ideas in the new national curriculum and the way that was supposed to address the biodiversity crisis in educational terms, but it's still a bit of a stalled process at the moment. We're hoping to give that a bit of a boost and get it kicking along. So we'll see how we go. So just as a bit of general context to this, I think most of you guys are probably pretty across this, so we'll jump through it fairly quickly. But there's a massive crisis around sustainability, in particular the biodiversity component of that, worldwide at the moment, and unfortunately it's getting worse. One of the saddest things in recent times, I guess, was the end of a decade of UN action on biodiversity. The end result was that the rate of decline in biodiversity had accelerated, which wasn't a glowing recommendation for what they'd been doing. So one of the things that came through out of a lot of that stuff in Australia was the so-called Melbourne Declaration, which was a series of deliberations that came out of COAG and other processes through the governments of Australia. And there was a really big focus on a sustainability approach, or an approach to develop sustainability in Australia that was based on education. And one of the things that came out of that was this idea in the new Australian curriculum, although it's probably not new now, but this notion of a cross-curriculum priority, and in particular the cross-curriculum priority around sustainability. And of course, biodiversity is a fairly significant slice of the sustainability agenda, estimates ranging from sort of 60 to 80%, depending on who you talk to. But it's in that context that there is supposed to be a lot of things happening in schools around Australia to develop a whole sustainability capacity within the Australian population based around education. Sad result is that the research and stuff that's been done on that space shows it's just not working. And I don't know from your own experiences how you're finding that, but certainly up here in the territory, it's not working at all, basically. There's a few outpost schools here and there where you've got a dedicated and informed teacher that's got a few things happening, but even so, when you look at some of the notions and implications around the curriculum and what it's supposed to look like, most of those schools are not doing that. They're still doing some good stuff, but they're certainly nowhere near where they should be on some of those fronts. So part of what we're trying to do is building a better understanding around why biodiversity is so important for people, because that's one of the things that came out of a lot of the research, was that people weren't really across what the issues were and why it was so critical. Also trying to build a better understanding of how to tackle an integrated curriculum approach. And I think that's one of the areas I'll talk about a bit more, but it's certainly one of the big stumbling blocks up here, is that the schools and the teachers seem to be so much under the pump around focusing on maths and English, and throwing a few other things in around that, like some science and whatever, but they're really not even in the mindset to think about a proper integrated curriculum approach. And I think that's one of the things that certainly we're trying to address up here, but also one of the things we're trying to address nationally. So part of the mechanism for that is providing guides and support for teachers, and also providing access to resources and process support for teachers so that they can get started on some of these ideas and hopefully build the confidence and so forth that they can become self-sustaining, really, and take off on their own rather than following a lead from someone else. So the curriculum integration stuff, and AAEE's working through a process around this, which is one of the things I'd like to follow up on out of this conversation through the forum, is this, what actually curriculum integration means and where it might go. There's lots of rumours around Australia that, you know, the next iteration of consultation around the curriculum and stuff will take this a bit further, but given the backlashes we've had against some of this from some of the conservative elements within education and society, that might not happen. But from my point of view, there's really two powerful components of this which we need to focus on, I believe. First one of those is that integrated thinking, or whatever we're going to call it, and that's one of the other conversations that might come out of today, is to sort out the buzzwords in whichever the preferred language is. So people are talking about things like transdisciplinarity, integrated thinking, and a whole host of other terms. But the big push behind that really is that if you don't have that, you don't have a chance of getting sustainability to happen, because by very definition, sustainability requires people to have a broad perspective on stuff. And one of the dangers demonstrated better than anything else in my time by cane toads is that people just thinking about their little particular silo can end up creating huge problems. And so there's a really important need to get integrated thinking as a part of it. The second one is much more fundamental to the education process, which is the cognitive sort of psychology research stuff that shows integrated learning is the best way to learn and build knowledge systems for kids, and that the more links you have to a piece of knowledge, the more likely it is to stick in your knowledge map. So there's two issues, and I'm sure we could come up with others, but they're the two big ones that I see as being really important to push back and help schools understand. Is that firstly, we have to have an integrated approach if we're going to get to sustainability. And secondly, there's some really fantastic learning and education stuff that comes out of that approach if you get to do it. And a good footnote to that I use with a lot of the teachers we talk to are things like that last line there. There's some really good reasons why Singapore and Finland are talking about getting rid of subjects out of their education system. In fact, Finland's moving to remove subjects from secondary education completely. Singapore's already done it from a lot of their higher education stuff. So there's some really interesting educational rationales behind those steps as well. And one of the reasons why it's interesting that those two countries are doing it is that they're seen as the world leaders in education. So when the media and others beat Australia up about sliding down the scales of educational quality worldwide, these two countries are leading those scales. And yet they're talking about some pretty radical changes to education because they don't think it's going as well as it could be at the moment. So jumping into what the Australian curriculum is supposed to look like, this diagram out of their site, I think, sums it up pretty well, in that you have this sort of three-dimensional model of curriculum that's supposed to be being implemented in our schools, but I certainly can't find a school in Australia that's remotely close to that. And in particular, a lot of our schools just seem to be stuck on the literacy numeracy bit and can't get to the point where they see that if they could integrate some of the other things into the way they're trying to develop literacy and numeracy, they'd actually go a long way further to improving their literacy and numeracy outcomes as well as all the other stuff. So there's some bits and pieces of technology, education and biodiversity stuff and other things in what I'm going to go through next, but it's really trying to help schools get to a point where the curriculum they're delivering in their school sort of resembles that model, which can be a bit of a challenge, but it's also can be a lot of fun. Now, the good news behind this is that nature exposure or environmental education or whatever you want to call it is actually really good for this, and even a necessary condition for humans if you want to follow through on some of the research. But I really like that quote from David Attenborough that he's never met a 6-year-old yet that's not fascinated by nature. And certainly in the work that we've done, whether it be with younger kids in primary schools or whether it be with the secondary kids, in being able to get them involved with the natural environment, often in their own school grounds, but sometimes at some of our environmental education facilities as well. They really do respond well to that. And so that natural world around us provides a fantastic way for people to get into some of these things. And I'm really looking at ways to try and establish what I call powerful learning. So getting kids into a learning mode where it really becomes self-fulfilling and they push further and faster than the teachers and anyone else is going to take them. So one of the aspects of this is a push to try and get schools to be active biodiversity places. And again, Sir David Attenborough put out a call, I think 18 months ago now, urging people around the world to use all spaces, gardens, roadside verges, to help wildlife. Well, one of the things that came out of that when you do an analysis of it is that school grounds are actually fantastic places for wildlife, potentially. They have large periods of time of relative quiet, interspersed with some absolute riots when the kids come out to play. But one of the things that's really fascinating, and this is partly Darwin, where I am, but it's fairly relevant to most schools I visited, is within the context of those cities or those spaces, school grounds are actually quite good places for biodiversity relative to the rest of the cities they surround. They often have reasonable vegetation or some vegetation, and a lot of the schools in Darwin, for example, have fantastic wildlife still in that vegetation and around their schools. But even if they don't, there's always something in those schools, and if you're struggling for space, then you can even just start looking at your soils and get into the biodiversity at that level. But there's certainly biodiversity available in our schools, and one of the really big issues, I think, is trying to get people aware of that and use that space so that they can do the sorts of things we want all the time or whenever they need to, rather than just for a couple of days or a couple of weeks when they visit another place. And I think there's a really great balance to be found between getting stuff happening at your school level and then going and expanding it into some other spaces. So we've been talking to schools about a sort of a 4-phase process around this biodiversity stuff. So the first one is getting a commitment from the school to basically implement the Australian curriculum properly and become a biodiversity school and implement the overarching idea. And that includes the sustainability stuff as well, but we tend to be focusing on the biodiversity component because that's the one that's probably missing out of the system worse than anything else. The next step to that is to then become a biodiversity aware school, which means taking the curriculum implementation plan and putting it into action in the school. And this is one of the areas where schools are really crying out for some sort of guidance leadership on that. So there's a conversation around what a 3D curriculum might look like and how you might program for a 3D curriculum and how that works. But there's not too many people around out there that have got that down. And I've been involved in a discussion with fairly senior levels of the NT Department of Education, and they can't put a handle on it either. So I think there's a real opportunity here for AAEE to create some resources and to provide a real service into education around that issue by trying to help clarify some of these things and provide people with a way forward. The level 3 stuff is about becoming an action school, so doing stuff in the school grounds. We've got schools doing things like their gardens, their biodiversity gardens, their bush tucker gardens, their biodiversity audits and a range of other activities just to try and start generating that activity and interest in the school, and a whole bunch of other biodiversity things as well through the science curriculum or the maths curriculum or wherever. And then finally leading through to level 4, which is basically taking the messages and the information out of our biodiversity stuff out of the school into the local community and potentially into parks and other places around the community as well. And it's quite fascinating to see kids' ideas on how they might do that. But it was a deliberate part of the strategy, because a big part of the need for sustainability is not just to understand the issues, but is actually to actively implement. So whether it be an energy thing or whether it be a biodiversity thing or whatever, we don't want people just talking about it. We want them to actually get that next level up. So one of the things we've done as a part of that process is to build this biodiversity schools database. And there's a website address there. I'll go through those again later on, and we might even get a chance to jump out and have a bit of a look at this thing. But I just wanted to go through some of the background and rationale for what this is, because it's basically a construction kit that we've built, which allows schools to build an online knowledge system. So it's web-based, it's cloud-based, it's got all of the basic capabilities in it to allow you to build your own knowledge database about biodiversity and related issues. But it's also been designed on the background of a lot of research and work that we've done over the years around this, and it's got a lot of learning facilitation stuff that naturally fits in with the way it's built to help scaffold learning activities and so forth. And there's a website, biodiversitywatch.org.au, which is sort of a supplement to this. It's basically a set of teacher resources and other things, but it also has databases of all the vertebrates in the northern half of Australia. So it's very much integrated with the science, technology and education focus that a lot of schools are interested in at the moment. Partly that's because it's one of the areas that schools are feeling like they're lacking in. One of the sad things about the conversations I've had in the biodiversity sphere is, whilst they're lacking in it, they don't really recognise that fact so much. They recognise they're lacking in the STEM area. So this actually packages those together. And a big part of that, as you'll see in the next few minutes, is because of the learning models and things that this thing builds into it, which come from a technology learning model that we developed some years ago. So from a pedagogical point of view, we're trying to make this real and exciting learning, because to me, motivation is a really, really key part of this process. And if you're going to get this rapid or powerful learning stuff happening, you need motivated kids. And what we found with this project at Waggaman, that you can see the photograph there from, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, the natural world stuff really provides a fantastic source of inspiration for kids, particularly primary, middle primary, but also you can use it to focus on various elements of that for higher level kids, senior secondary even as well. So really a lot of this has been about finding ways to excite and motivate kids to get to that deep, rapid learning process where they're going to invest a lot of their own energy, time and interest to create learning that lasts, and also more importantly that has an impact on attitude stuff. So as an example, the photograph here of the bowerbird doing his dance, and there's a whole bunch of video and other stuff that was collected. This was part of a process where we used a remote sensor camera and set that up in the school ground and captured all sorts of photographs of stuff that was happening around this bird bower or nest. And one of the things that's really fascinating for me with this, and the kids really responded to this amazingly well, and they were just so excited about it, and there was observations and stuff happening all the time and so on. But if you look at the latest Attenborough movies, one of the big documentaries, they've got this footage of the bowerbird doing the dance around his bower with his purple crest in display and a piece of glass in his mouth showing off to a female. The kids at Waggaman captured that exact same stuff on their own camera and were able to really get into so much stuff around bowerbirds that was amazing. And for them to be able to see that they were capturing stuff the same as what Sir David Attenborough puts on television was pretty motivating. So it's trying to make this stuff as real as we can. And obviously not every school in Australia is going to have a bower in its backyard, but there are other things. And one of the great things about this technology model is using imagery and stuff to capture moments that you then take back into the classroom and extend. And that's a big part of this learning model. The other thing about the motivation thing is getting kids to shift their attitudes and also extending their learning time aside from what we're doing in the class today. So the quote there from Jenny, one of the teachers at Waggaman, that she found quite amazing was that the Year 6 boys, sort of being what they are, went from sort of being in mode where they'd be throwing stones at wildlife around the community or around the school ground to being really excited about what was happening in the playground, but also becoming sort of custodians of the wildlife, happened in a matter of weeks, which was a really interesting component. And you can see there on the right, this is one of the note things on the wall in the classroom where they take observations from, in this case, the frill-neck lizards that hang around the school and the neighbourhood. And some of those are things that came back to the school from outside of school. So one example there where several blocks away from the school, one of the animals that had been marked in the process of the school was seen by the kids. So they're actually taking this stuff home and outside of their normal class time, which is a really important part of getting them to become real sustainability practitioners. Another component of this is the technology enhanced learning component, as we refer to it. So a lot of people, when you hear talking about biophilia and a lot of other problems in environmental education spheres, people want to ban technology and keep it out of the way and try and get kids to forget about their mobiles and so forth and get out in the bush. What I've found is that's actually quite counterproductive, and it's much better to put that into practice. If I could just suggest those who haven't, hit the mute button on your system so you don't get that noise interference coming from somewhere. So one of the things we found is really, really powerful is this idea of getting kids engaged to the point where you get them taking photos and doing things as they do activities so they can document and produce stuff about it later on. And one of the things that was particularly fascinating with things like iPads and mobile phones, getting kids to take pictures with those means they actually have to be really, really careful and really, really quiet and learn to move around in the environment in such a way that's not going to disturb the animals. Otherwise, you've got no hope of getting close enough to take a photo. So if you've got a big camera with a zoom lens, it's one thing to get 20, 30 metres away from something and take a picture of it. But if you're using an iPad or a mobile phone, you've got to get within 5 metres usually to get a decent photo, and that can take some doing. So it really makes kids think about being quiet, respecting animals, doing a lot of those sort of things. But the big thing I've found with this is this digital publishing component and being able to get the process transferred from the outdoors back into the class and keep the kids excited and interested enough to do the follow-up work where a lot of the learning happens. And the other thing that's come out of this, which is now seen as really important in schools, is because of the way this database system works, you're actually creating, I'll just go back to that previous screen, you're actually creating a system of digital publishing where kids become the publishers. And so they're creating these sorts of systems, which gives them a certain level of awareness about how information actually gets on the internet. And that's a really important part of the newer things that are emerging around fake news, in trying to get people to understand how these things can be put up that might be completely wrong or might be right. You don't know that, you've got to check that. So in the process of taking information, developing it into something and putting it into our shared knowledge system, you're actually developing a whole set of understandings and expectations which quite strongly address that issue around that. Okay, another part of this is this constructionist learning model, and I understand not everybody's down that pathway as far as they might like to be or as their parents might like them to be, but there's some understandings I think that are really important. So, I mean, most people in education are familiar with Piaget and the concepts around constructivism with a V, talking about the theory that knowledge is really something that students do rather than not supplied by the teacher. But this word with the N talks about that becoming, learning that is, becoming especially powerful when you construct something that's shareable. And that leads to the conclusion, as Papert used to talk about when he was alive, that giving kids better opportunities to construct stuff is really a powerful way to address these sort of issues. And so in this system, we're really talking about adding a level of digital learning scaffolding, as I call it, which is, you're not just talking about text and pictures anymore, you're also talking about audio and video and a whole range of things. But most importantly, you're putting it into a shared knowledge space where you can collaborate around your ideas and you can build it up in pieces with other people, and you do a whole sort of thing. And in some spheres now, people talk about that as a Wikipedia effect, where once you start building these shared knowledge systems, there's a whole range of interesting learning outcomes that come. So what we're doing with these approaches is harnessing a lot of those elements in the school environment to try and improve learning outcomes around biodiversity and sustainability. It's also very flexible in the sense that, and at the Waggaman trials that we've done over the last couple of years, it's been quite student-centred, and I can say that safely because there's no Waggaman people on this teleconference, I don't think. But there's a long way that they could move in getting a much more constructionist model in place in education. And they talk about doing that as part of their transition over time. And some of our other schools up here are doing the same thing. They're having a conversation about what that means, but they're a long way from it at the moment. But a lot of them are actually thinking that biodiversity and the sustainability cross-curriculum priority is the key that might allow them to do a more flexibly programmed constructionist learning style. So we'll see what happens on that front. But certainly there's a lot of flexibility in the way these online database systems can help you. So you can cater for some quite student-centered stuff, but you can also do quite structured stuff. I mentioned this one earlier, but that notion of building shared knowledge skills just helps kids with a whole range of communication and social skills. It's really interesting to see the dynamics of that when you're in the sorts of conversations that come up around some of the group work that was done in this, but also about which pictures should we load up on the website, what's the relevance of this piece of information, what's the level we need to pitch this at. There's a range of really interesting conversations that come out of that, which help build communication skills, collaboration skills, social skills, as well as the biodiversity awareness stuff. We've also talked about this, so I'll jump through it, but it's, I think, an interesting conversation that we need to have about this whole integration notion and how that actually applies in practice. Digital literacy, again, we've mentioned it on the way through, but it really is a core part of, I think, getting kids into sort of exciting learning processes. And I'm going to see how this works. So I'll push the play button and see. But this is an example of, I guess, a digital era assignment. So this was done by Sade, who I think at the time was a 6-year-old Year 4 student at Waggaman Primary as part of that project. And as context to it, and you'll see an image come up as we go through it, after school, on her way home, there's one of these little goannas climbing up the wall of the school, and Sade took a picture, or had a picture taken of her standing near that. That then triggered a whole bunch of interest in this particular animal and a bit of a research project, and this is her presentation, which was then created and put on their shared knowledge system. So let's just see if it works. I'm just going to try and run that again with the headphones out.
The spotted tree monitor Varanus scalaris lives in the trees and is a very good climber. It can easily climb around the buildings at our school. They usually feed in the trees but do come down onto the ground to eat. They eat insects, frogs and smaller lizards, and they also eat eggs and baby birds in the nests. They grow to about 60 centimeters long. Sometimes they eat baby cane toads and die. Hopefully, if we don't get too many toads around, we can keep the goannas at our school.
Hopefully you finally got to hear that. So when you pick apart something like that and look at what's happened, there's a whole range of skills, if you like, or whatever you want to call them, that go into creating something like that. So there's a whole bunch of research being done. There's planning and scripting of what's going to be said. There's the oral language practice to record the audio file. There's a set of design issues and stuff around picking which images and which bits and pieces I'm going to either make or get from somewhere to incorporate. So the process was that Sade, with a whole bunch of help from various people over time, and this happens in a school classroom, writes a script, edits the script up, gets it to the point where she's happy with it, and she then does some practice reading it, getting herself comfortable, and then it was recorded onto a mobile phone. The audio file was then put into iMovie, I think, in this particular case, and then a series of images and bits and pieces were dropped along the audio file, and then an output file of a video comes. So there's a huge range of bits and pieces that have gone into making something like that, but then it becomes an object which gets attached into the database as part of the information about Varanus scalaris. So that information gathering and reorganisation stuff, and a lot of the information the kids will get something that they picked up from a book or from another website or somewhere else. But there's an interesting quote there from Bruna about how facilitating learning can just be reorganising existing information. I think that's one of the things we see quite a lot with these sorts of projects, is where students are gathering information and taking it back into their knowledge system that they're sharing with others. There's a lot of really interesting conversations and thinking about how these bits and pieces of knowledge hold together. And so it provides a really interesting learning space. Part of the other integration stuff here, and I guess this was a pretty special opportunity where we had a research project, citizen science thing happening around the school as well, which meant some of the frillnecks in the school were captured and weighed and measured, microchipped, had numbers put on them and were let go. And so I use this example here as a part of my presentations to schools, where you say, okay, you take an experience like that where we're doing measuring of a length of a tail, where does that fit into your curriculum as something? And I think that's the big message around curriculum integration. It doesn't just become maths, it becomes a whole range of other things, and whether it's much simpler than that, measuring soil particle size or whatever it is, it's still a measurement activity, but there's a whole range of other things that need to be thought about in that, which is what the Australian curriculum tells us we should be doing. And I won't go through those, but those key concepts are part of the sustainability overarching idea. And they're the three core guiding principles that are supposed to be helping set this stuff through. And you can see they're quite general, but they do map very well across so much of what happens in schools when you're doing anything to do with biodiversity or outdoors. So that the things we're trying to get, as we mentioned earlier, just a summary there, is this attitude changing engagement happening in schools and getting a big shift in student awareness and observations. I was quite surprised when we started the project at Waggaman was just how quickly teachers commented on about how the kids were just noticing so much more around the school about little things that were happening, this animal, this bird, this flower, these sorts of things that were part of the everyday conversation, and some really interesting observations coming back out of that, which just showed that the kids were really interested and engaged with this stuff. And a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that there's a process. So when I jump into the database in a minute, it's designed to encourage kids to make observations and add those observations into the database, as well as gather their broader information and add that. And we tended to start this process with a biodiversity audit, which lots of people do, but this allows that biodiversity audit to populate the database and become a starting point for a whole range of information. So one of the questions I want to come back to are mapped out on this screen here, but I'm just going to jump out of that for a moment, and I'm not sure what you're going to see when this process happens. So I'm just going to try and switch out of this for a moment. And go into this. So Peter, are you still online to talk? Are you able to see anything up on screen at the moment, or do I need to go back to the share screen? Can people just type in the text box if they can see a screen that says, "Welcome to the Biodiversity School site"?
No, we can see your desktop.
The desktop, right, okay. That change it, or can you still see the desktop? What about now, Hilary? Can you see the...
Yes, we can see it says, "Welcome to Biodiversity."
Okay, okay, good. I just wasn't sure what was projecting. So this is the front portal screen to the Biodiversity School site. And up here you get access to whichever school you actually are part of, and then you can log in. So the system's designed in such a way, if I actually log into it properly, that different people will get into different systems depending on their login. I'm just going to jump into the Manage Animals screen and have a look at the basic structure of this. So what this system does is it provides schools with a blank template system. You get full control over the menus, and you can create and add as many menus as you like. You also get this database system designed for biodiversity stuff, so plants and animals. Each one has a record which you can fill out, and part of the process with the Waggaman trial was we started with that point, was getting the kids to research the wildlife around the school and around the local area and find out information about them, and then create and add database records for each of those animals. And that process introduced a lot of the scientific names, languages, categories like reptile, mammal, etc., and a whole bunch of other things that are part of the sort of science curriculum. Each one has this media tab, which allows you to attach something to that record. Now, those attachments might be a picture, they might be an audio file, they might be a digital story like the one Sade did for the Scolaris. They might be a PDF file, a Word file, they might be a story, a poem. No real limit to what that might be. The other one is the observations tab, which has got no records in this particular case, but if I hit new observation, it just brings up a blank where I can type something in. And so designed to get the kids over time to keep adding information about their biodiversity stuff. The rest of it you're seeing over here is an admin login. So you've got things where you can manage the menus and the pages and the users, administration functions. If you're a normal school login, you won't see all that. And the logins that you give the students, they will only have limited ability to do some things in this site, not all. So, for example, they won't be able to add menus or change the content in those menus without the teacher's login. But with their own logins, they can do things like add observations and update information on the general site. It's also got the ability to upload images and so forth. So if you've got a picture on your mobile phone or your iPad or a camera that you've downloaded onto a computer, you can actually upload those things to that. And part of what we've shown the teachers with that is that if you've got kids doing something like drawing pictures or art, making models or whatever they are, it's really quick and easy to take a photograph of that and add it up onto the site so that long after the wall display or the information that we've got happening in the classroom's finished and gone, the record of it's still up there on the system. So I won't go too much further than that, but just as an example, one of our environmental education places, Riala, they've been using this to load up their wildlife stuff. And at the moment, they've got 256 plants and animals loaded up into this system. So when their students come visit the Environmental Education Centre, they're able to use their mobile devices or their school iPads or whatever they've got to go and look at the plants and animals that they're seeing around the site. And there's also then activities where they can add their own observations and information to some of that as well. But the system just provides the access for all those sorts of things to happen as part of the visit. But it's also something that, of course, because it's online, the kids can do as a before and after thing. So get their heads into the place before they come and can also do follow-up activities once they've gone. So that particular part of the process is really designed to help with those education processes around biodiversity. This biodiversity portal that I mentioned, I'll just quickly jump through a couple of things in this. It's basically got the main databases in it for things, and kids often use this as a resource, but the parts I wanted to show just quickly is the schools component of this, which talks about that biodiversity database, what it is, some of the learning theory stuff, the structure of it, ideas for use. But it also goes through some suggested activities and helps people with some of the bits and pieces that we use, how we go about some of that sort of stuff, some of the projects that have been done at some of the schools and just general projects that have been done over time. We're adding resources there on how you go about that. The other component to this is the library. And one of the reasons why we built this in North Australia, where you're in the wet, dry tropics, a lot of the resources that are developed in other parts of the country don't make a lot of sense. So if you're talking about spring, summer, autumn and winter and so forth, they don't quite map across. So there's a range of identified issues with biodiversity type stuff and environmental education in the tropics that don't match up. So we've made this resource as basically a library database system to help people find resources that are relevant to North Australia, and some of those are specific, some of them are much more general. But there's also the Sustainable Schools website that does this as well. So we hook teachers into both of those, but try and make them understand that a lot of those resources don't necessarily map across from the other one that we're experimenting with as part of this process, and this is one I'd like to open up a bit more of a conversation with you guys about as well, is training systems for teachers. One of the things that's been identified up here, at least, is that professional development has changed massively since the days when I used to work in the system. In those days, the education department used to fund a huge amount of professional development and pay people to do that work. Nowadays, it seems to be thrown back on the individual teachers who have a responsibility to update their diaries about PD and log that with the education authorities to prove that they're continuing to develop as a teacher. And one of the issues we were looking at from the AAEE group up here is how we might provide some support resources for teachers who are interested in this stuff. So we've actually built this e-learning system, or part thereof, that's designed to help people get their heads into various aspects of the curriculum and bits and pieces that back up that, and talking around what the curriculum is, how it works, what you can do about it, and a range of other things. And so one of the issues that I'd like to follow up out of this conversation today is for people who are potentially interested in playing with these sorts of things, is actually to build some resources in here that we think might click with teachers and add some additional stuff to this. So anyone who's feeling energetic and got some ideas they might like to share, that might be one way that we could go about providing some access to things for teachers that they can use in their own time. The particular view I've got of it at the moment is not all that detailed, but it does have some interesting pieces in it, like videos that you watch segments of and so forth. Maybe this one has got it in here. Okay, I'll just check this and see what happens. So part of the process here, if you play this video, it doesn't play the whole video.
Wanting to record it. When you think back,
it just plays this couple of minute segment out of the middle where they're talking about a particular issue.
Led to such a deep.
Hopefully you can hear it.
With how the natural world works.
Well, I've never met a child
Who's not fascinated?
who's not interested in natural history. So, just the simplest thing, a 5-year-old turning over a stone and seeing a slug, and says, what a treasure. How does it live? What are those things on the front? Kids love it. Kids understand the natural world and they're fascinated. So the question is, how did you lose it? How did anyone lose the interest in nature? And certainly I never lost it.
Yeah.
But if you do lose it, and I imagine there are lots of other attractions that can divert your attention, you've lost a very, very great treasure.
At what point did you decide that you wanted to make it your life's work to help record?
I don't think I ever dared say it was a life's work, because I thought when I started there wasn't any television.
So you can see from that it just plays a certain segment of the video and then asks a question at the end of it. So that's another idea that we're playing with in terms of how to get people switched into some of the biodiversity stuff. And as it goes through, it gets into more specific activities around concrete ideas around how do you attack biodiversity strategies in your classroom. But it's just another mechanism we're trying as an idea to see if it will get teachers interested. So this is the Sustainability in Schools website, which has got a great set of resources and teaching strategies and other bits and pieces in it as well. So there's a range of those sort of resources that we're trying to point people to. So Well, hopefully you're back to the slideshow view. So part of what I'm interested in now, if we can, this is where we can use the text, but also potentially start up some audio conversation as well about answering these sort of questions. What things do we think would help schools the most? But also this this follow-up idea. So the AAEE website has a members area which has a forum system in it, which, as you'll see when you go in there, hasn't been used a great deal in recent times. But we've now rejuvenated some of that. A lot of you probably won't know your passwords, but on the front of that site, there's a reset function for your password, which just requires you to put your email address in, and that will fire you back a new password, which will allow you to log in. So one of the things I'm hoping we can do in follow-up to today is set up a discussion in that area that might take us a bit further than what we can just do, because we are getting, well, I'm not sure. Peter, what time is the demo you and what time are we finishing this? Not there. Aha. So as far as I can tell, it must be heading towards 5 o'clock down there, which means we've got a little bit of time left, but not a lot.
Down here in Canberra, it's 5 to 5.
5 to 5, yeah. Okay, that's fine. So they're really where, for me at the moment and for AAEE nationally, with some of the things we've been talking about, is what sorts of resources, information and approaches do we think might be best for helping teachers to get their heads into this curriculum integration function, getting the biodiversity and other stuff into their mindsets as the way to potentially trigger that integration and to make it work really well. And I guess this is the age-old question that's been around for a long time. When I've been involved with AAEE since the late 80s, always been talking about resources for teachers. So what do you guys think? Have you got any particular really good examples? Because just to put a bit of context on this, when I was doing the professional development work full-time around technology stuff for the education department up here back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the curriculum rollout happened into schools, it was really suffering because it was one of the first ever examples of an integrated curriculum thing. So when the computer technology resources first started to come through, there was an expectation that they wouldn't add a new study of subject or area of study, they would be integrated across the curriculum. And a lot of teachers really struggled with that notion, and for a start at least, it was basically a license for schools and teachers to ignore it. And there was a lot of work went into trying to get people's headspace to shift. And eventually what worked was getting a whole bunch of really good resources and activities that were demonstrating core elements of the things we were trying to get people to understand. And that was really just pointing out how to use this, how to do that, how to do this in a way that was pre-packaged for teachers. So an example, one of the things that really helped break that open was the release of the Australian First Fleet database and the Australian Convicts database and the Australian Explorers database, because all of the people in the middle primary, upper primary years and early secondary years were dealing with those topics somewhere in their curriculum. And when it became obvious to people that you had a really great resource to use, and in doing so, you were not only having great outcomes in terms of your subject material, but you're also ticking off all of your requirements in relation to technology, people went, oh, is that all we need to do? And then once they got through that point, it was really easy for them to start creating their own. And I suspect we're at a point with the curriculum integration stuff around the cross-curriculum priorities where we need to do the same sort of thing. And I think quite a few of those resources already exist. And as an example, the people on this teleconference probably have a collective expertise of activities that work for them or that they're aware of that work really well that we could use as a starting point for getting those resources together to help teachers take those first few steps.
Can I say something? Or
yeah, go for it, please.
Canberra.
Yeah.
We're in A squared, E squared in ACT is looking. We've got, as I said before, we're doing a consultation on the future of education in the ACT, and we've been asked to contribute in terms of, you know, environmental and sustainability. And it seems from talking to different teachers, you're spot on what you're saying, in that there's just, teachers say that there's a lot of resources out there, and then they're not sure, they don't have time to go through them in detail and see whether that's, you know, right for my 5-6 class or right for my preschool class. You know, and that's sort of where I think they could, well, our chapter could help in terms of, you know, putting together ACT specific resources. But obviously there's a lot of just general resources, but stuff, you know, to do with their local area and that. But, you know, it's just, there's a lot out there online, but if, as a teacher, you're right, they've got to have something that they can easily pick up and implement that's not going to add, because they're so overloaded already.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important point that we got out of some of our consultations here. One of the things was there's so much stuff online, but there's actually too much, and it blocks people from actually finding things that they think are really good, or it takes them too long to find it. So one of the things we've tried to do in the library system is you can just add a URL to a location where you can find a resource, but you can actually then just pick some curriculum linkage points and some year level points out of a data system, which then helps teachers when they come in, say, I'm looking for stuff for middle primary, and they can just pull out the middle primary stuff, or if I'm looking for stuff around a particular curriculum area, it's classified in that way. And so it's really providing that extra layer of local information that helps people make that connection between something that's potentially useful and something that's actually useful, but I also know that it fits into the curriculum and it fits here for me. Viv, one of the questions, what sorts of resource, like in the territory, when a teacher's looking at their weekly program they're delivering, they've actually got a whole heap of words on, often nowadays on Microsoft Word, but often still on a piece of paper as well, that maps out their curriculum stuff. And they've basically got, in most of the ones that I've seen, they've got their maths and their literacy and numeracy and language stuff mapped out, and that's about it. Some of them are starting to get a little bit of science and other thing mapped into it as well. Back when we were doing the computer stuff, one of the things that we work with principals on was just to add another column on the end of that grid that was your integration points. And basically it was in those days asking them to put how their computer stuff was going to be integrated this week. And it was just a few dot points, but it made people think about it explicitly as to what we're going to do. And I'm thinking that one of the suggestions we might push through AAEE back into the schools for this is that you just add another column on your work program that's got your sustainability overarching idea content in it. And you just put some points in there about what we're focusing on this week and how we're tackling the integration. Do you know what your teachers have in there in terms of how their daily programs or weekly programs look? Or anyone else for that matter?
At the present moment, I'm working at the Botanic Gardens, but I'm an ex-science teacher, you know, worked in the ACT. Yeah. So that sort of concept, it just seems that here we're doing quite a good job in the primary schools. We have programs running there, but once it gets, like I've taught in high schools and colleges, once it gets further up, it tends to narrow down to more the science students and the geography students and the SOC students, and other teachers. Just, you're talking about silos before.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not thinking about how I could do something in maths or how I could do something in my art course. I mean, there are some teachers around that do, but as you say, you know, my perception is it's patchy, you know, in terms of, and I think that sort of thing you're proposing would be, you know, quite good.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else out there wants to comment on what happens in their place?
I'll add a short point from Queensland. Sorry, my voice isn't very good at the moment. I'm on the tail end of a flu. But I'm based in Queensland, and we've worked with teachers through a natural resource management group, specifically focusing on biodiversity for a number of years. And we found that one of the issues over here was not so much the lack of the resources, but again, yes, that there was an overwhelming amount of them there, but that teachers often wouldn't use them until they had a direct professional development session on how to go about using them. Like, there were some really brilliant resources, and I think that what you're suggesting looks brilliant, but it would possibly also run the risk of being lost in the multitude unless there are some really targeted sessions, you know, showing people how to use it, and so they can see how amazing it is. We also had issues with, I guess, teachers not feeling like they had enough skills in the area of biodiversity. They were reluctant to embark upon activities in that area because they felt they didn't have the expertise.
Yeah.
And that was one of their concerns as well. But I think there certainly seems to be a lot of resources out there in Queensland at the moment. Teachers, what they do, depending on different schools, it can be very prescriptive about what exactly they're doing in the day. Like the way the Australian curriculum has been interpreted here in certain schools, individual classroom teachers can have very little control over what they're getting to do. It can be very prescribed for them, and unless your Education Queensland area, you know, sees that particular topic as a priority, it can be really hard for that to be progressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, very true. Any other thoughts around that?
Could I just say something? I'm from Sydney, and I'm a primary school teacher. And I'm doing my PhD, so I'm in and out of schools at the moment. And what I'm finding is that teachers, it's like what you were saying, Renee, they don't have confidence for a start. They keep seeing me as the expert, even though I'm learning along, and I keep saying I'm a co-learner with them and lead learner with the children. But they still keep saying, oh, but you're the expert. They think I'm really good at science. I'm not. I'm absolutely hopeless at it, but it's my enthusiasm. But also, I think that they're really, they just, because there's still this push, like what you were saying before, that there's a push for literacy and numeracy. And schools are really pushing it, and the teachers don't have any way out of that. So I would be even suggesting that even if you sort of got something together, somehow developed something where it actually incorporated, so your biodiversity was actually in literacy and numeracy, even if units of work to start off, you know, you were talking about the convict one. If you did something where you actually use literacy and numeracy as the platform, so then otherwise they're going, this is all too much. They can't cope with it. And, you know, that idea that you were saying about putting another column onto a program, I've worked with that before, and I've seen people just put it there because they have to, because it's being ticked off in the box and don't refer to it again. So that would be just my idea, to come at it from the literacy and numeracy you know, people don't even realise, like I use Newsella articles a lot, and they're all lexiled. They're, you know, they're from really good resources, Everyday Papers, Guardian and that kind of thing. A lot of teachers don't even know that's out there where they can integrate it with their reading programs.
Yeah.
And, you know, give children all the same topic, that they can have a big discussion about it as the springboard, you know, to go on.
Yeah.
So that would be my idea.
Yeah, look, I think that's really helpful. I mean, one of the things that I've been having a conversation just recently with one of the schools near Darwin that's talking about trying to take the plunge and turn their afternoons into student-centred learning time. And one of the conversations that came out of that was, I said to them, well, why are you just talking about the afternoon? And they said, well, the mornings focus on literacy and numeracy. And I said, well, if you're going to do this properly, you need to integrate that. So if you look at the cube that's out of the curriculum, what I've been saying to people is, you know, if you track down from English or the language stuff, from language and maths, there's supposed to be some content material or subject material that you're delivering in there. So, you know, you might be doing this literacy stuff to get kids to learn how to write a report or to read a particular type of thing or just to improve their reading skills or whatever. But you've got to give some thought to what the subject material is. What are they reading? Why is that particular reader? And a lot of people don't seem to have that level of thinking about this. And I think that point that Renee made about how, you know, the system can be very prescriptive about what we do, because there's some fabulous wildlife books. So if kids are doing poetry or doing whatever else, we've been trying to get the teachers to understand that look for content in your reading or your maths or whatever that maps across to biodiversity type stuff. And I think that's one of the actions some of our group are talking about doing next is trying to go back and identify those sorts of resources and present them to schools in exactly that way. So they're going to be taking things like this. One story was written up here about some researchers and Indigenous people and golden bandicoots. It's a great little kids book, and it's also perfect content for using in this sort of space. So you can get people into that space through the literacy corridor, hopefully. So yeah, definitely, I think you're right on that front.
I agree with that, but also when you were mentioning before about the push for STEM, because I think that's you know, that's the buzzword. You know, they suddenly seem to have discovered their maths and science and various other things. You know, not that the professionals haven't been telling them for years about it, but anyway. But you know, since it's the buzzword and the flavour, I think that's also a way to approach. I like your approach in terms of, you know, collecting data and, you know, talking it up that you're using a lot of STEM skills to build up biodiversity databases and collect information. And I like that approach. I reckon that would appeal. It's in terms of getting it into different parts of the curriculum.
Yeah, look, I think you did right there. I mean, I did a talk a couple of months ago now to a bunch of schools from a cluster in the northern suburbs of Darwin. So their vice principal type people were all at this cluster meeting, and they wanted to talk about this stuff. And when I mentioned the biodiversity stuff initially, there was sort of this, yeah, look, it's really hard to justify time and expenditure on professional development unless it's an item that's on our school action plan for this year. And what was interesting to me was that almost none of them had the cross-curriculum overarching ideas on their school improvement plans for this year, but every single one of them had STEM. And when I got to the point where I was talking about the STEM linkages and the way this integrated with all the STEM stuff, they all perked up and got really interested. So I think there's a lesson in that, in trying to package this message and get it out there through the sorts of areas that they're actually focused on at the moment. And for a lot of our schools, that is currently STEM. The education department up here is telling me that they're basically finished now going through all the curriculum areas in the Australian curriculum rollout. So they started with literacy and numeracy, now they've done the HASS stuff, the science stuff, etc., etc. So they're now contemplating making the sustainability and other cross-curriculum priorities the next phase they push schools on. So what that may mean is that next year a lot of these schools might have that in their school action plans, which means they can justify much more easily funding professional development or resourcing some time to stop and think about it. But I'm not going to hold my breath. But I really do think that's where we should be spending some of our time in terms of mapping this across those areas, so it's a way for people to pick it up. Yeah. Just trying to keep a tab on some of the comments that are coming through in the chat. They're good.
Yeah. I was just saying, from what I can, gather, if you could get the STEM related things in, because there seems to be the perception that, if we're doing environmental stuff, it's soft, not, it's just sort of off from the curriculum kind of thing. I think if we can, I think the idea of mapping it right into that you're doing an essay, can't you do it on some sustainability or environmental thing? If you're doing collecting data, looking at what's around your area, can't you do it at a data collection and use a lot of maths and science skills? I think that would make it more important, and then people would actually, principals and that would see it as something that they need to participate in. Yeah,
I think you're right. And I think that's a really important part of the professional development approach we take, is we need to make sure we, from a pedagogical point of view too, it makes sense for us because we're trying to talk about integrated curriculum. So instead of just going back to schools and talking about biodiversity, we should be talking about that in a very integrated sort of way. So the literacy and numeracy components, the STEM components, and there's some pretty natural mapping of the biodiversity components in particular across the science curriculum, and most people make that connection fairly easily, but there's also lots of really easy ones to make into the language and other areas. If you can get people to identify what their priorities are, like if it's report writing or if it's some other procedural texts. When one of the things we found great fun with at Waggaman was the kids had some Indigenous people coming in showing them how to make mats and baskets out of pandanus, and it was the perfect lead-in for writing procedural texts. So the language curriculum for Year 5 has all these different writing tasks and issues and styles. One of those is procedural texts, and that was a perfect way to map it in. So I think we should be trying to help people with that very integrated view of the way our curriculum should work. Sorry, just looking again at some of the text messaging. Has anyone else got any bits and pieces they would like to add in?
Can I ask a question about the pandanus activity that you just talked about?
Yeah. Sorry, you're going very faint.
Is it possible to make a recording of that as a PD, so as a training resource, so that people can, sometimes it's difficult to imagine something working in your class. If you have a bit of a snippet video, a bit of commentary, it's then very easy to see how to do that exact thing, and then also easier to see how to vary it for your own location. And that'd be brilliant. Yeah,
we certainly can. I mean, I'm not sure this is going to work, but we'll just try it and see. You might see some weird stuff for a minute before I get to it. But that was the wrong thing to search for. Are you guys seeing a picture of pandanus?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is one of the endpoints of that project, and I hope you can hear this. We actually made some talking book resources. So basically one of the things that we always do with these sort of projects is you take lots of photos and you use those photos for that digital publishing process that we talked about earlier. This one went a little bit further than that. No, it's not working. Pity. Just let me try one more thing here. I'm not sure why this won't work, but basically the kids did audio, or the teacher actually did audio recordings of this. And as they went through this storybook, it reads it out to you and highlights the words as it goes. But it was done one language in English and the other language was done in the native indigenous language of Yungamata. But yeah, we can certainly put some of those sort of resources around so people can get at them as a way of going about doing these things. And you know, one of the things that we also did in this process was these things were turned into just books. So using Word to drop the images and text onto a page and then print them out.
I think these sort of short YouTubes are a great way of the professional development for teachers, because I just find everybody's overloaded with words, and you know, if they're looking for something to support their program, you know, quick access to seeing what other people do is a very way they're likely to access and pick stuff up. Whereas, you know, long documents and things, people just don't get around to reading or just don't have the time.
Yeah, yep. That's certainly an approach. One of the things we are working on at the moment is that professional development thing that I showed you a snippet of before with Attenborough and Obama having a conversation. We're using that approach quite a bit with our own video stuff as well. So making videos, interviewing teachers, that sort of stuff. But also the digital story technique that I showed you with Sade's project, where you've got an audio and then you illustrate that audio with images. So if you're doing a activity like the pandanus weaving stuff, you can write your narration, record it, and then just put the images on it and illustrate it and use that as a resource for teachers. I think we can do some stuff like that.
What was the program that you used to create that story about the pandanus where you were able to put highlighted text at the bottom?
Yeah, look, I did that in a program called Macromon Director, which is a moderately high-end multimedia toolkit. I think we can do the same thing in some shareware-y type software called LiveCode as well, but that's more of a technology focus. But we used to build things like that when I was working in the computing side of the education world as templates so people could make their own. And the problem at the moment is getting the highlighting to match the words, and it didn't work today anyway. But you can build them so that they read the text out just in web-based stuff as well, but you can't get the highlight to work. But there's a range of tools. If you want to send me an email, my email address was up on that last slide. We'll get back to it eventually somehow.
Where are these slides going to be? Because I'd like to sort of share them with others.
That's a good question. I'll have to answer that one somehow. I mean, I'm happy to send them to people, but they'll probably be on the AAEE website somewhere. I'm not 100% sure whether they've got a set container.
Yeah, I found, yeah, it was really sort of crystallised, yeah, various ideas sort of in one place, and also how you're using your site, what's there, which I hadn't really looked at it in detail.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be, you know, I just would like to at least share it with our members.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to follow up with that. And
Okay.
I'm actually coming down to the New South Wales State Conference in a couple of weeks to do some workshopy stuff around this stuff too. So if any of you are going to that, be a chance to catch up.
Yeah, I think there are 3 coming from the ACT, so we might be able to catch them. I'm actually going as well.
Yeah, great.
So
But I'm also really happy just to use email and whatever else to dialogue through this. And if you guys want to do some follow-up workshops, we can use this technology to do it as well. All righty.
Thank you very much for sharing your time and knowledge and all of the great resources that you just showed us there, Graham. That was really interesting.
No worries. Pleasure.
Yeah, it was really good, given that we're sort of looking at this stuff at the moment, how we can help and support our teachers to do more. Well, some of them are doing great things, but it's patchy.
Yeah, that's
we've got to make it easy for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's the really big challenge, is to make it systemic so that the whole system's pushing it rather than just the individual teachers. So there's some definite challenges in there. Yeah.
So just with the wrap up, with the follow on from this, what did you, basically what's on this your screen now? Is this what you want to happen?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm more than happy to put things into practice if people are interested. But certainly where we're trying to go next is to get those professional development things into a form and a fashion where teachers can start to use them and benefit from them. Getting people's ideas as to what they think are the most natural and easiest connection points between the biodiversity stuff and the other areas of the curriculum. I mean, we've obviously got ideas around that, but it's always helpful to have other people's inputs into that. So part of that will continue as a discussion in that forum system. But, emails and other things are fine as well. So, yeah, I'm happy to pursue it with whatever. The National Executive is going to have a conversation soon about potentially resourcing a project around this space to try and work out a new way forward on this whole professional development focus, because that's obviously the one that's really missing out of everywhere at the moment. Is all the stuff that came out of those research reports were talking about teachers needing PD. I mean, people mentioned it again tonight as well, where teachers don't have the confidence to get started. And often I think that's one of those roles the PD stuff can do, is to give people the confidence to say, yeah, look, you're there basically, you just got to do this and this and you're away. And once they get started and feel empowered by that, then off they go. And I think that's getting people over that hump and getting started. That's the really big challenge at the moment. So we've just got to work some strategies around how that might work.
It also helps to spark, when you talk to other people, you realise other people are in the same position and don't know where to go or what to do. Yeah. And it can sort of enthuse you to sort of, do something. Because if you can get started, that's the whole thing. If we can just help teachers to get started.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's part of our focus. So if we can work strategies through that, follow through on things where people have got projects we can support, it'll come out of that conversation. So I think we can make some real progress. And that was part of why I wanted to set the forum up and have it as a space where we can continue this conversation, because often you do these sort of workshopy things online and then that's sort of where it ends. Well, hopefully in this case, there's an ongoing conversation for those of us who have got time to put some effort in, or just to keep tabs on to see where it goes for people who are too busy. So that's what we're hoping. All right, guys. Unless anyone's got any other questions or other bits, we might have an early mark and go and have a coffee. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.